Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everybody. My name is Becky Malay. I represent the Coalition for the UN We Need. It's a global coalition that has been doing monitoring of the Summit of the Future, and we are committed to strong multilateralism and the strengthening of the UN systems. I also represent here the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. I was co-chair global of the coalition in 2016 until 2020. And right now, I'm one of the conveners in Asia. And I'm very happy to welcome everybody to this forum, which is looking at the Asia, particularly what the Asia futures is going to be. So our webinar for tonight is actually convened by the following organizations: Coalition for the UN We Need, C4UN, APSD, represented by Anselmo Lee. It's the Asian Civil Society Partnership for Sustainable Development, and the Asia Development Alliance, or ADA, represented by Zia Abdul Rahman. The AFF is a collaborative initiative and aims to address the challenges and opportunities emerging from the 2024 Summit of the Future and its follow-up processes. As we all know, the Summit of the Future has committed to the Pact of the Future, and the Pact for the Future has 56 action points, and referring to several important developments all over the world that need attention by the member states and civil society and all other actors. We had an Asia Futures Forum in November 23 to kick off with the primary objective of facilitating meaningful civil society engagement in the 2024 summit and its follow-up processes by bringing people's voices and concerns grounded in the lived realities of Asia into global discussions. In 2026, a series of webinars and consultations are being organized, beginning with the first meeting that we held in February 25 during the UN APFSD held in Bangkok. And we have additional ones. This is the second one. We have another on April 8 and another on April 2022 to discuss the specific chapters of the Pact for the Future. And of course, look at how developments have happened or not happened. So tonight, I welcome everybody. I hope we will have a very good discussion, and I hope everyone is engaged for tonight's discussion, despite of all the problems that we are experiencing. So with that, I'd like to open the floor. I'd like to go back first initially to the discussions that we had, no? The discussions that we have in the opening sessions are very, very important. And for now, we thought that it's important to look at the guiding questions for presentations and discussions. We're looking at the Pact for the Future commitments that we identify as the most relevant. Later on, Anselmo will look at the details of those. But tonight, we're going to have. I'll go back first to our key messages from the opening session. No? I'll jump into that immediately now, just to frame our discussions where we are now. So, from our discussions in the opening session, we saw that the SDG progress in Asia is far behind the overall progress of the world. To address this situation, states should implement the commitments made in the Pact on international financial architecture reform, sustainable and efficient social protection systems, and rights-based digital cooperation, among others. No? This was iterated by Zia in his message in the beginning, but we had discussants that really looked into the details of some of the chapters, no? And on the peace issue, the disconnect between ambition and reality is of concern for civil society. Political, financial, institutional, and structural challenges are hindering the implementation of the pact. We call for establishing measurable implementation benchmarks, guaranteed structure for civil society participation in the follow-up mechanisms, and linking different agendas of peace, development, climate, technology, and governance, rather than treating them as silos. No, while principles in the GDC are very strong, uh, the implementation mechanisms are very weak. So we need to mobilize, align national policies, foster local engagement, and support multi-stakeholder collaboration, including youth, women, and marginalized communities. So we must also raise awareness about the Pact for the Future, so that's not just in our own bubble. So we want to strengthen the political will and identify concrete steps to implement the provisions in the Pact. And of course, we need a strong participation of youth and communities in these processes. We must build a global system that works for the future generations, not something that adds to the profit of the corporates. Member states and the UN must prioritize the long-term survival of the people, including the future generations, over the short-term profit of the few. We need to make sure that civil society continue to feed into the UN processes of the UN 80 processes, and that these conversations should not be top-down. Those of us here today who have experience of working with communities on the ground will be directly impacted by the UN 80 and the ones who should lead the evidence and narrative from the bottom up. So these were the insights that were shared to us by our very good resource speakers from the first discussions. And now we want to carry on to the second session, which will be very interesting, and we'll be delving into the issues of peace and sustainable development, or the SDGs. So that's just to frame our discussions for tonight, and let us see how we will proceed now, because we have a very tough evening to prepare for, but nevertheless, we are warmed by the presence of everyone here, and I'd like to go straight to introducing our keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker is Jomo Kwame Sundaram. He is a Malaysian economist who currently serves as the research advisor at the Kasana Research Institute. He is a visiting fellow at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University and an adjunct professor at the International Islamic University of Malaya. He is based in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia and was Assistant Secretary General and stayed with the UN for 11 years, which I just learned today. So let us welcome everybody. Everybody, let's give a big hand and welcome to Jomo. Jomo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Becky. Salam alaikum to all. Salam alaikum is an Arabic greeting, which basically means peace be upon you. And I think we are living in times when this appeal is more urgent than ever before. Unfortunately, it is very much ignored, precisely as it is often, as much as it is uttered. Let me try, we have little time, and let me try to approach the subject of SDGs and peace in terms of 4 subtopics. So allow me to basically, is the video working?
Yes,
Somebody
you can see it.
Yes. Okay. Allow me to focus particularly on these four topics to help us to organize the discussion in a way which hopefully will be useful. First, I think it is important to recognize that the recognition of sustainable development, for those of you who may not remember, was actually not something which came easily. The West, through the Secretary General at that time, pushed the idea of Millennium Development Goals around the turn of the century. And after that, it was the frustration with the limits of the Millennium Development Goals and the particular approach it had, that basically there was a movement towards recognizing something which was more ambitious and much more in line with the aspirations of developing countries, especially. And out of this was the commitment to create, to have sustainable development goals to replace it, the SDGs. And this was basically largely decided around 2012, and this was made possible partly by the leadership of Brazil, who hosted not only the original Earth Summit in 1992, but also the Rio Plus 20 conference in Rio de Janeiro in in 2012. Now, this basically one of the SDGs makes a very clear commitment to peace. Peace is really understood as a condition for development, and it's very important to recognize that it is also something which almost all faiths consider to be fundamental. Last week happens to be an occasion when not only the Muslims celebrate the Eid, representing the end of the fasting month of Ramadan, but also Hindus had a holiday last week on the same day, as well as the Persian calendar, the Nowruz, or the New Year, the beginning of spring, was celebrated. And of course, very soon the end of Lent will come when Christians will mark the Easter, and that of course represents a very major struggle. And also there are other celebrations around this time. So I think the question of faith becomes quite important, and I think it is important for us to recognize that we need to try to embrace a broad range and the diversity, and to be sensitive to that diversity, because it is that sensitivity which ensures the unity. Now, let me emphasize that we are now living in extraordinary times. Some people call it post-normal times, but I think it's important to recognize that many of the values which many of us grew up with, I'm maybe older than many of you, but certainly I think it's important for us to recognize that, when I first started studying economics, in the late 1960s as a schoolboy, the you taught when you taught economics, you were basically told that you had the options between producing guns or producing butter. Guns versus butter. That was the way economics was taught in those days. Today, that is not even presented. It just shows you how much values have changed, norms have changed in economics itself. And what we have seen in the recent period is a celebration of the increase in military spending. I was listening to a recording of an interview with Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, who is very much celebrated by people because of his speech at Davos a few months ago. But he had made a pledge to double military spending for Canada. And to make things even worse, the Chancellor of Germany has basically made an argument to that future growth in Germany will come from military spending. What is called military Keynesianism is the future, and this, of course, has some history which I won't get into right now. But I think it is very important to recognize that during the lead up to World War II, the fascist movement was very much on this basis, whether it was in Germany or Japan, or Italy or Japan. So I think we are facing this challenge. Almost all European countries, if you remember during the Trump 1.0 era, Trump basically asked his European allies to increase military spending to 2% of GDP. and almost nobody did anything about it. This time he said 5%, and everybody has said, yes, sir, three bags full. And so we have seen, the Western allies are all united in this direction. Volkswagen, for example, signed an agreement 2 days ago, basically saying that they will increase military production rather than car production, because they anticipate that the internal combustion engine will decline, especially with this crisis of energy in the Gulf, and this will basically mean that EVs will take over. So we are seeing a very significant change in values, in norms, and the celebration of the increase in military spending rather than its criticism. Nowhere to be seen, in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, there was, in the UK, for example, there was something called the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Nothing like that exists in the world today. And this is, I think, very, very, it's really a sign of the times. Now, let me mention that although the SDGs were decided and agreed upon in 2015, the progress on the SDGs has been modest, to say at most. In fact, there has been a great deal of regression, and although poverty numbers continue to go down because of the way poverty is measured by the World Bank, hunger numbers have gone up in some years during the last decade, if you look at the FAO data. Now, this is a very curious thing, because the way poverty is defined, more than 60% of the poverty line is supposed to be for food. Now, if you have increasing hunger and then you have declining poverty, what is happening? And part of the problem, of course, is that everything is measured in terms of money. Many people in the countryside who have other sources of food besides those you buy in the market, they are often better off. I remember doing research many years ago in a village, some of whom were growing rice, and the other half of the village were growing rubber. And although the people producing rubber, the children of those producing rubber were earning far more cash incomes than those growing rice. In fact, the children of the rice farmers were better off in terms of the usual anthropometric study measures of lower arm circumference and so on and so forth. So you can see that even our measures are hugely problematic, and so you might get figures which give you the impression that poverty is going down and so on and so forth. And throughout this period, we have seen an acceleration of income inequality and acceleration of the concentration of wealth. And this has increased very much in the last decade or so. And there are various different ways. Previously, many of us talked about financialization, but more recently, you will find that the new emphasis is no longer on finance, but rather on tech. And the most influential group which joined Trump's 2.0 campaign have been the so-called tech bros. These are very important people who control Silicon Valley and so on and so forth, and they have been able to make a lot of money because of the support of the U.S. government in various ways. I'll come back to this in a little while if there's time. The second point I would like to discuss very briefly is the whole question of financing. Last year, there was a very important financing for development. The fourth meeting of the Financing for Development series of conferences was held in Sevilla, in Spain. But unfortunately, it hardly produced anything. True, I think we have to acknowledge that the Spanish government did some good things and tried to set a good example on its own, but there was no support from the rest of Europe. And now you can see the isolation of the Spanish government in terms of its position on the question of the war in Iran and so on and so forth. So you can see there is perhaps some small divisions in Europe where you find the divide is on various different lines. Kaya Kallas, the second highest official in the European Commission, who's in charge of foreign policy, was introduced to was brought in to replace the Catalan predecessor, a Catalan socialist predecessor, who basically made a very important speech in the training for the European Diplomatic Academy, where he said, "We in Europe are like a garden, and there are those outside of the garden who want to invade our garden. We must protect our garden, and we cannot just wait for those outside to invade our garden. We have to go out to make sure they do not invade our garden." This was the attitude of the previous her predecessor, but she was even worse. And the reason he was replaced was because he was more ambiguous on the question of Gaza. He was more ambiguous on a number of other issues. So it's very important for us to recognize that there is a very strong pattern to this. Now, Kaya Kallas has replaced her predecessor because she was much more supportive of the Netanyahu government in Jerusalem. So we now have a situation where the forces are aligned in many different ways. And before we started this discussion, we had a brief mention of the election of a new Secretary General, and it's very important for us to do whatever we can, because the Secretary General can do much to accelerate the decline of multilateralism, or play an important role in making it much more relevant in the foreseeable future. Now, the second point, I think, which is important for us to recognize, besides the fact that FFD4 produced next to nothing, is that ODA, or Official Development Assistance, has also been declining throughout the 21st century. And in 1970, the rich countries promised to give 0.7 of 1%, 0.7 of 1% of the GDP to developing countries, to poor countries. In fact, the current level of ODA is 0.3 of 1%, not even half of what was promised in 1970. This is how far back we are regressing. And whatever little was given by the Americans, as you know, Mr. Elon Musk basically eliminated that when he was the head of Doge, ostensibly in the interest of government efficiency. So this is the kind of situation which you have. Another issue which has come up has been the question of tax. And there was, and you will notice that during Trump 2.0, there has been the comeback of an economist from Chicago by the name of Arthur Laffer. And during the Reagan period, from 1981, Laffer was very influential, and he made the arguments for getting rid of many taxes, especially progressive taxes, and basically said the less you tax, the more economies will grow. In fact, there's no empirical basis for this. And even Reagan's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors left and didn't want to continue as the chairman. And in fact, one of the first papers he wrote when he went back to teaching was to show that, in fact, Arthur Laffer was basically talking through his nose. There's no empirical basis for the claims he was making, but yet, nonetheless, he has come back now with Trump 2.0. So the tax counter revolution is a very, very important issue because you will see that there has been a struggle to resist progressive taxation, not only nationally, but also internationally. And when the proposal was made, a proposal was made to have a tax rate of 25% of profits to be allocated according to different kinds of formulas. And this was discussed, And what we find is that the Americans, particularly the Treasury Secretary at that time, Janet Yellen, said 25% is too high. Let us stick to the current American rate, which is 21%. So everybody sort of was resigned to that. And then Boris Johnson, who was then Prime Minister of Great Britain, basically used the G7 meeting he was hosting to claim that there was a consensus within the G7 to reduce it not from 25%, not to 21%, but further to 15%. Now, basically, developing countries, particularly in Africa, and I think it's very important to recognize that the most coherent group among developing countries are actually the African group. They are far more coherent than the Latin Americans and certainly much more coherent than the Asian group. The Asians have never been able to organize and to cooperate and to establish solidarity in the entire post-war period. And unfortunately, the situation continues in this period, despite their common interests on many issues. Anyway, so the rich countries, through their club called the OECD, basically push this approach, and many finance ministers from developing countries signed on to it, and the African group refused, and they led an effort to have the discussion shifted from the OECD, which is basically a rich man's club, to the United Nations. And so there is a very important process, and it's very important that other developing countries, especially in Asia and even Latin America, get behind this effort to resist the OECD and to continue to push for the UN leadership in this area. So this is, I think, a very important issue because there's almost no money for the SDGs, and it's all very nice to talk about wonderful goals and so on and so forth when there's next to nothing for what is called the means of implementation. Now, in the meantime, what we have seen is that developing countries were encouraged, particularly during the last decade, to borrow more. And to borrow more, interest rates went down, particularly in the US, and consequently in the rest of the world. And so developing countries borrowed quite heavily, and some countries more than others. Now, when however, the inflation became a problem, particularly around 2022 onwards. What we find is that interest rates were pushed up by many of the central banks in the rich countries, and as a consequence of that, we find that the developing country, sorry, the a number of countries got into very serious problems. Almost nobody talks about the poorest countries, but the poorest countries had a huge amount of money for them leaving their countries, and unfortunately, even middle-income developing countries who are the vast majority didn't even do anything or say anything for them. But middle-income countries were the ones to get the most attention. And so you have countries like Sri Lanka and Senegal. Now, what is important is that both Sri Lanka and Senegal subsequently elected quite progressive governments. But these progressive governments have not been able to do very much because they are constrained by IMF and other strictures. So it's very important to recognize that you can have a progressive government with the best of intentions. If you don't have funding, you can't do very much. And it's very important for us to address this question collectively. Now, basically, for poor countries especially, credit costs went up. Most of them couldn't afford anything, and so you had a huge exodus of money from the poor countries who had been borrowing away at very high interest rates to the US. It was called the flight to safety, and this basically meant whatever little money the poor countries had was largely lost. The third point I want to get into is quickly to talk about the geopolitics. I think it's important for us to recognize that that I'm not sure what a lot of what is called geopolitics. I often cannot see what the geographical element is in geopolitics. Of course, we talk about the North and the South and so on and so forth, but North and the South is political rather than geographic. So, what is the geo in geopolitics? But I would still go back to recognizing the continuing importance of political economy analysis, and to recognize that what is called geopolitics is often a code word to refer to what is emerging as a second Cold War, a new Cold War. And this, I think, is important for us to recognize. In other words, the ideology, which was supposed to be what the divide in the first Cold War was about, is no longer important. It is a divide between the North and the South, and perhaps the East and the West, and this, and where developing countries are particularly hard pressed. Now, ostensibly, this is not ideological, and it's important for us to recognize this and to be realistic. We have to be realistic, and if you look at what is happening now in the world, it is these developing countries which are trying to address these kinds of issues in recognizing that they have a very common interest. But you will find that there are many deterrents to solidarity, and I don't need to get into them right now. You're all familiar with some of them, but we can talk about them later if it is of interest. So basically, what you have now is that the West, particularly the so-called realist school of international relations, has decided that it is China who is the main threat. The Soviet Union is over, doesn't even exist. The Russian Federation is a shadow of the former Soviet strength, and it is really China which is fast emerging. And so you find a lot of discussion around this. Now, I think it's important for us to recognize that we have a new phenomenon as well, in that there is a new right. The left has been so weak in recent decades that the right has emerged, and the right has been split, and it is the right of people like Donald Trump, which have emerged as dominant. The old right has not been able to survive compared to the new right, and they basically are not averse to using economic and military threats. And often these threats are in order to bully. But for many people took the whole tariff issue announced almost a year ago very seriously. In fact, it was just an excuse. You basically, since you have nothing to force developing countries with, you don't lend them money, you don't do anything. So what you do basically is that you threaten to impose a tariff on them. And you call them reciprocal because that reciprocal tariffs are allowed under WTO rules. And whereas unilateral tariffs are not allowed. So you call them reciprocal tariffs, and that is basically the threat of tariffs and the other threats are basically ways of extortion. If you think of when you're growing up as a kid, the neighborhood bullies and so on and so forth, and later on other types of extortion rackets, which some of you might have encountered. Now, the fourth and final segment is basically to do with multilateralism. And I think it is important for us to recognize that Trump is only saying what has long been happening in the West. And Trump we owe a lot to Trump because he tells you what he's up to. He doesn't mince his words. And if he doesn't care for multilateral institutions, he tells you right in your face. And this is basically what has happened. Whereas this was made clear by Mark Carney in his remarks in Davos 2 months ago. So I think it's important to recognize that the gloves are off. Okay, the male fist under the velvet glove is now showing, and we need to recognize that for people like Trump, multilateralism was useful to deal with Cold War One, but now Cold War Two is different. Geopolitics is different. You don't Multilateralism doesn't serve anything useful. But wherever they have privileges, they want to protect those privileges. So you have a permanent seat in the Security Council with veto power. Hold on to that. WTO membership, you need a consensus, and even one country can block a consensus. You hold on to that. This is especially important because, as I mentioned earlier, the new form of accumulation of wealth, besides finance, is basically the control of technology, and it is basically the control of intellectual property. And this is basically why it is so crucial. And you basically see that the protection of intellectual property rights through TRIPS is a very important issue. So that is one thing which is important. And the end of the WTO, the decline of the WTO, particularly the so-called dispute settlement mechanism, was not started by Trump. It was started by Barack Obama. He basically refused to appoint any new judges because he was unhappy because there was a Korean judge who had made a ruling which the Americans didn't like. So don't blame Trump for everything. The so-called rupture which Mark Carney talks about is not really a rupture. It has been a slow and gradual process. The only thing is that that uh, Trump is reading out the subtitles. If you go and watch a movie, you don't understand it's a foreign language to you, but the subtitles are there, and Trump is reading them out loud so that you understand and know what on earth is happening and why he's doing what he's doing. So Trump basically, as I said, is basically a bully. They want to have extortion. They want to extort, and for that they want bilateral deals. They don't want plurilateral deals, let alone multilateral deals. Okay, and this I think is very important to recognize. So when everybody is smaller and militarily weaker than the US. So when you're dealing one-on-one with the US, it's very, very so-called asymmetrical, and the US has a huge advantage. And that's why Trump always wants a deal. So if we take, for example, something like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Area, was supposed to involve three parties, the US, Canada, as well as Mexico. Trump said, no, change it. We have the USMCA, US, Mexico, Canada, because with USMCA, he will deal directly with Canada, and he will deal separately with Mexico. So this is the kind of tactics which he uses, and it's also important Trump is often referred to as a transactional president. It's important to recognize that for those of you who are interested in things like game theory, Trump's transactionalism is very limited. Game theory, it's a single game. It's not a repeated game, because in a repeated game, you learn what the other side is doing and so on. So it's and for Trump, it is always important in any encounter, in any deal, that he prevails. His interests prevail. This is extreme, and this is basically fundamental to his negotiation approach. And it's very short-termist. He doesn't think about the longer term consequences. He doesn't think about the collateral damage and so on and so forth. So in many ways, he is also prepared to harm American interests because he doesn't look beyond the short term. And many people are commenting about what is happening in the Iran war and why this is becoming very, very clear. He's not getting any support from his European allies vis-a-vis Iran and so on. I shouldn't say no support because the Europeans are all providing logistical support from the airfields and the naval bases and so on. Um, so what you have basically is short-termism. It's not very complex, but it's important that the U.S. wins. And this is the kind of approach which he basically has. So Trump wants to win every deal. He cannot lose, and this is important. And overall, he doesn't really care very much as long as he not only wins, but he is seen to be winning. Okay, because this is his so-called brilliance of the so-called art of the deal. Now, yet another issue to consider, for example, about what has been happening in the world and why multilateralism is no longer very convenient for most things, is that Trump basically doesn't care about soft power. I mentioned earlier that the velvet glove has come off. The male fist under the velvet glove is now being exposed. And he did this with Doge, with Elon Musk, cutting all the instruments of of, of soft power, closing down USAID, and so on and so forth. So basically, and then directly getting rid of and rejecting multilateralism, pulling out of WHO, pulling out of the climate deal, and everything where they do not have anything to gain from it. The only thing he wants to hold on to are the Security Council and the WTO for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Now, basically, the question for the global south, and I presume all of us are thinking primarily about the interests of the global south. What are the options here? I think one of the most urgent options is to pursue and strengthen the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement has existed since 1961, but for the last few decades, it has really not been very significant. But the thing is that it's so difficult to build a new organization. You take an existing organization and revamp it to serve contemporary. That is, I think, the most useful thing to be done if there are progressive leaders whom you are able to influence to do that. Without state power, of course, there's no point talking about it. And now we see that the last two leaders of the non-aligned movement are both under attack, namely Cuba and Iran. Okay, these were the last two leaders of the non-aligned movement. So you can see its relevance. I spoke to the current Indian minister once in a public forum and said, why have they turned their back on the non-aligned movement? Because India did something very good at the end of the 1980s. It hosted the non-aligned movement meeting and then created institutions for research, one particularly called RIS, to provide research support. But now, since Modi came to power, that institution has been transformed into an auxiliary of the Ministry of Commerce. So basically, what we see is that it has been extremely difficult to get the developing countries to act together, and that's why I keep on emphasizing the leadership of the African group, particularly at the United Nations. They have very few resources, but they have done quite well precisely because they have been able to get the act together. So it is important also to recognize leadership matters, and we are now living in an age where there are no more leaders of the global south comparable in stature to people like the late Nelson Mandela. And even from the global north, people like Willy Brandt, who was prepared to talk to the global south and try to understand the global south, and was responsible for leading and financing two commissions to talk about these kinds of issues. So I hope this has been useful for you to try to understand the challenges which we face together, trying to go forward. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jomo. Very enlightening and gives us new perspectives on how we want to look at the world now, because it seems very confusing, but at the same time, things are actually becoming clear. So we have a lot of questions from our audience, not live ones. They're here in the chat. Are you able to read them? Okay.
I'm afraid not. Maybe you could
Okay,
just
it's fine.
you, you,
I'll read them out. Um, from Anselmo, what is happening to WTO? Is it functioning now or in a coma? Do you expect anything meaningful from the WTO ministerial conference to be held at the end of the month in Cameroon? The main agenda is to address crucial issues in the global trading system, including fisheries subsidies, small economies integration, and the future of work. And then another one, do you think an alternative multilateral mechanism is possible that challenges the political economy, considering the war and conflicts? And then another one from Anselmo, that was from Zia, the other one. The new world order is in the making, but in the midst of a geopolitical confrontation and crisis. How and what do you see the role of G20 and BRICS? Can both or either play any meaningful role in the non-polar world or a more multipolar or plurilateral world? Uh, and then the UN is selecting the new SG in 2026. What is your assessment of the current UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in the last 9 years? Can you play any meaningful role in the making of can the UN still play any meaningful role in the making of the new world order? So those are the questions.
yeah, I was not able to write down enough, so please help me
Yeah.
out, Becky.
Yes,
Let
please.
let me try to address the ones I remember off the top of my head. As far as the UN's Secretary General selection is concerned, the president of Chile, who had nominated, agreed, who had Michelle Bachelet, the two-time president of Chile, and who had held important positions in the UN. Um, Katz has withdrawn his nomination of uh,
Bachelet.
Bachelet. And my own suspicion is it has come under external pressure to get rid of her. But I cannot prove that, so I won't go say more than that. Now, if she is still in the running, because still has the support of Brazil as well as Mexico,
Yeah.
I would say she's probably the best candidate available.
Mm.
She has both multilateral experience as well as national experience, a two-time president, and so on and so forth. And now it is often
Yes.
said that she is not acceptable to China because the last thing she did when she was head of human rights was to publish a report on the Uyghurs situation, which was prepared by a rapporteur who was clearly quite biased. But anyway, it was released under her leadership, and so. But I think the Chinese recognize that there are limited choices, and perhaps they will not veto. I believe that they won't veto her, but because of this so-called perception, there has been rather limited support in the global South for her, and there has been no attempt to try to get support outside, except by people like Lula. Lula has a strong presence in the Lusophone countries in Africa, and as well as beyond. And the Brazilian Foreign Service is really quite formidable, and they can do a lot. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of Mexico. And under earlier presidents, Mexico had basically deserted the South to join the OECD and so on and so forth. So it is the heavy lifting will have to come from Lula, who is also very preoccupied with getting re-elected under very strong pressure from the right, who are being supported by Washington. So
Yeah.
that I think is still the best candidate. I think I personally know the Secretary General of UNCTAD, and her husband is the former Deputy Permanent Representative of Israel at the UN, and and many people think that she would be a good alternative. I think I don't share that particular view. She's from Costa Rica.
Yeah.
Uh, but she has had before after UNDP, she held another position as the head of
Oh,
the countries which speak Spanish in the world. And so she has a reach, even though she's from a relatively small country, she has a big reach. The Alicia Barcena has not been nominated again because um, uh, Me Mexico has decided to support um,
Shelley.
decided to support Michelle Bachelet. I
Mhm.
don't know enough as to whether or not Bachelet's nomination can continue without her own country's support. But I think it is very important that she represents. She is probably the best candidate, even if there were, if the the sentiment to have a woman Secretary General is quite strong, and I think that should be taken quite seriously. And she is probably the best candidate for that for that for a whole variety of reasons. But there will Trump is probably going to support the head of the International Atomic
I,
Energy Agency,
mhm.
the who is who nominated and supported by Milei of Argentina. I
Mhm.
don't know very much about him, so I better not say anything. But um, there are a few other people who have been mentioned, um, um, and um, I don't think many of them have been. They have been mentioned before in a lot of speculation, and I do not think any of them represent a, 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 a good option. Now, let us remember that these kinds of elections are not whether you get your preferred candidate. It always has to be a compromise. Okay, so there's no point saying, oh, she was not good on this issue, she was not good on that issue, and so on and so forth. If you want your perfect candidate, you're in the wrong place. I think, we have to be quite realistic about this. And there are no strong left progressive forces. Now, let us look at you. Somebody asked about Guterres, and he's an old friend, a former colleague. So I don't particularly think it's useful at the end of his career to say very much about him. But he was for 9 years the chairman of the so-called Socialist International. He was
Yeah.
prime minister of Portugal,
Portugal.
and so on and so forth. So, I mean, people are disappointing and so on, but I think many of his problems, some of his problems are of his own making and the making of some of the people around him. But most of the problems was because he happened to be Secretary General of the UN at this time. These are very, very difficult times.
Yeah.
You can't blame him for the decline of the UN entirely.
Yeah.
What we would like is almost irrelevant because we are not represented at the interstate level, and we need to have the support not of the membership, but the support of of the entire Security Council. And so
Yeah.
including the US. So I think it is very important to recognize that. Now,
Mhm.
um, the role of the WTO, going back to Anselmo's question, I think we are now in a very dangerous situation. Ngozi, the Director General, was a former a friend and so on and so forth. But basically, there are two friends who have become very powerful people. The one who is most powerful is Kristalina Georgieva from Bulgaria, who is now the head of the IMF. She owes her position entirely to Macron. So I don't think she has that much independence and so on and so forth. But nominally, she has a lot she has a lot of things. And she tried to do some good things while she was there. But basically, couldn't get much support. She had difficulty getting support even from Janet Yellen. And so, basically, people who want to get a second term, they become a bit more opportunistic, and that's what basically has happened. Same thing has happened with the Director General of the WTO. And now there's a danger which I want to alert colleagues about. And the danger is the following. If you look at what is coming out from, not from the WTO officially, but what they are trying to transform the WTO into a WIO. What is a WIO? A World Investment Organization. Ngozi already announced this, that she wants to have a world investment. She wants to have the WTO, which doesn't have a mandate for investment, but she
Yeah.
wants to use it to promote investments, investment facilitation, etc., etc. And she thinks she's doing something for developing countries, particularly for Africa, and that's how she's justifying it. But I would caution strongly against it, because basically what has been happening in the past is that a lot of this so-called investment facilitation has been used to use government power to support and guarantee private investments. And this is a very, very dangerous shift which is taking place. So we have to be very wary. I would not say no completely, but I think we have to be very, very wary about what is being promoted. And we have also to recognize that many countries in particularly in Europe, for them, these international agreements are a big deal. The US doesn't care, or at least pretends not, it doesn't care. When it serves them, they care. Like as I mentioned earlier with TRIPS, with the intellectual property rights. But when it doesn't serve their interest, they really don't care. And it doesn't begin with Trump. It begins with Obama, and arguably even before that. So what we have now is a situation where the champions of trade liberalization, ironically, are countries like China. Okay,
Yeah.
the world and the movements of an earlier period in which many of us started activism is now doesn't exist anymore. It has changed,
Yeah.
and the problem is that the WTO leadership is interested in continuing. Okay, and Ngozi got the second term. So basically, both Ngozi as well as Kristalina Georgieva have both made a deal with the devil to get their second terms. And what did they do? I mean, they basically did something which is it's not really legal. They got confirmed for the second term at the end of the Biden administration, knowing that that this was not going to happen under Trump.
Yeah.
So so you know so you basically have a situation, and it's very important that, and because Ngozi is doing all this in the name of helping African countries to grow, to invest, and so on and so forth, it is important to work very closely with African governments on these kinds of issues. And there are real issues. I mean, for example, the mineral investments, the rare earths, and so on and so forth. There are very difficult, complex issues about mining, about taxation, and so on and so forth. I mean, I still remember that the World Bank, about 35 years ago, they promoted gold mining in Tanzania. Tanzania was a very poor country before. Now Tanzania is the third largest gold producer in Africa, after South Africa and Ghana, which used to be known as the Gold Coast. Now, this has come about, um, and to avoid corruption, okay, Transparency International was at the forefront of this. To avoid corruption, they said, oh, let us not have any taxation on these gold mining companies. So the effect of it is that gold mining in Tanzania is so lucrative because you don't have to pay any tax, because you're being attracted to invest there as a responsible, so-called responsible investor. So to get to, and nobody pays attention to this, and we often approach these issues nationally. We don't do enough collectively, because when it comes to solidarity, when it comes to this is crucial, because although you need a consensus to get any WTO legislation through, for all intents and purposes, all it confers is a veto to the US. Nobody else can exercise a veto in the WTO except the US. Okay, so these are the realities, and we need to pay attention to these kinds of issues. Um, Becky, you have to help me with some of the other questions. I cannot remember.
Yeah. There are some other questions, but because of our limitations in time, I'd like to just read them out, and then you can probably just write your response to them if that's all right. This
No.
relates.
I cannot do so because I don't have.
Yeah,
I cannot keep up with yeah.
yeah.
Either
It's
either
okay.
either you select one or two questions which you think are important for which
Yeah.
most people are interested in, and then we'll go with that.
Yeah. Okay. The rest of the questions are actually what you have discussed and where you have gone. And then what is the most important would be any advice to CSOs about strategies to addressing the military industrial complex and the militarization of economy in Europe and other countries where spending is really just put into militarization. And do you have any advice for CSOs to how to engage on this issue?
I don't have any. I mean, every conflict is complex. It's unique. Every single conflict. The worst conflict right now, nobody pays attention to. It's the conflict in Sudan, because you have, on the one hand, the Sudan government forces, and then the RSF is being supported by the Emiratis. Okay, so these are all developing countries involved in causing this. And this is very important for us to recognize that developing countries can also be, hugely problematic. And we
Yeah,
need to call them out. We need to call them out. But the important point I want to make here is that, in any fight, developing countries are going to lose unless you have been preparing like the Iran has been preparing for years. Okay, if there's an invasion in Cuba, the only thing which will hold will be the resistance from the Cuban people. It will not be because of the arms which they have and so on and so forth. And this is basically the main fact. So basically, what the whole idea of fostering the idea of popular resistance is probably the most important thing, rather than to participate in the arms race.
yeah,
And to basically, what you can be done, of course, is to support those forces in the West who are against the militarization of the world. And there are some forces, I mean, some stronger in some countries. Mélenchon is quite strong in France. Many of in the recent elections, Mélenchon's pro-Mélenchon forces did reasonably well, and so on and so forth. But you know, I there has the whole idea of national defense is quite important, because if you look at the Sudan conflict, it is a conflict which has been manufactured by outside powers. In this case, by developing countries, because whether they want the land or I don't know what the motivations of the Emiratis are, but this is the casualty rate is very, very high in Sudan, and it is the potential breadbasket of Africa. Okay, so I think we have to look at these issues, and perhaps you all can take the initiative in trying to encourage discussions of this. But I think to have a simple one-size-fits-all formula is also erroneous because each conflict is quite different. And of course, for example, in Southeast Asia in 1973, the foreign ministers of Southeast Asia got together and declared Southeast Asia as a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, ZOPFAN. Okay, Carlos Romulo,
Yeah.
and Adam Malik, and so on and so forth. But what happened, of course, at that time was that Marcos continued to host the American club base and Subic base and so on. And then after the ETSA uprising, when those governments when the government of the Philippines changed, there was for about a decade or so, that momentum was still quite strong, and Subic was closed down, Clark was closed down. Okay, but what happened was that GMA was the one who basically brought the Americans back.
Yeah.
Okay, supposedly to deal with terrorism and so on and so forth. So first they got rid of Arab, and then they brought in, and then GMA took over, and she promised not to run for president and broke her promise immediately. So she was president, effectively, she was president for almost a decade.
Yeah.
So it is very important to be careful about, all this anti-corruption movement and so on. I mean, I know that in Philippines is, one of the cleverest acronyms I've ever heard is acronym, the anti-corruption movement. Okay. Now that's very clever, but you get carried away with your own propaganda, and you begin to lose sight of the larger situation. There are still many people who are Filipinos who are celebrating that Duterte is in The Hague, facing trial and so on and so forth. So we have to recognize that ultimately it is the national movement. If we are going to be more influential, it is because we are part of national movements. National movements basically on an for want of a better term, an anti-imperialist basis is very important. And this is easier done now, thanks to Mr. Trump and his behavior. It's easier done now than at any other time in recent history. So I think it is very important for us to, yes, these are very difficult times, very tough times, but it's precisely for that reason. Okay? And he's so blatant about his racism, he's so blatant about his Islamophobia, and so on and so forth, that there is tremendous potential to mobilize, but not to mobilize as many of the more conservative or even reactionary elements are doing, but rather to offer a different type of leadership and direction.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Jomo. It was a very good discussion. It's really hard to moderate because we all need to hear from you. And we really think it has been a very good discussion that we had. Thank you very much. Let's all give Jomo a big hand, a round of applause, and a big thanks from all of us.